this is Lauren Hollows for NOI Education Services, and today we are talking about the top 3 mistakes that I find people doing in mapping all of the time. Okay, guys, so let's start with number 1. There's a whole bunch of reasons why people make mistakes in mapping, and I think that it's really important to understand the problem when we map incorrectly. So when, for example, you are about to come up for an audit or you're going through validation, if you haven't mapped correctly, then it's highly likely that that's going to lead to a non-compliance. Now, the reason it's going to lead to a non-compliance is the way that we go through and do our mapping validation is we take a look at the mapping, we take a look at what it says. So let's say it says that this particular criteria links to question 1 or practical activity 1. We go and look at that practical activity at that point that you have told us to go and look at. And if there is no clear link there whatsoever, we cross that out and go, well, that's not valid. Okay, and we do that again and again and again. And so this is where it starts to become really, really problematic because it very quickly leads you to a place where all of a sudden your assessment is not valid and that invalidates your entire assessment system. So the problem number 1 is that we over map. Okay, we map everything because we think there's like some loose connection to it and we want to put more and more evidence into there. Or for some providers, you guys set rules as to why you need to have so many particular points. I have addressed that in a topic. You do not need to have 3 assessments for every point. If you do, go and take a look at our video, Stop Over Assessing. But this is just a very, very common thing that people overmap all the time. And again, the process that I'm following when I'm doing a validation is I'm going through and I'm taking a look and I'm going, okay, they said question 1 maps to this knowledge evidence. They said question 1 maps to this particular, performance criteria. And quite often performance criteria and practicals, this is where questions linking into what is effectively a practical criteria become really problematic. Okay, because if the criteria is student demonstrates how to ride a bike, then the question tell me how to ride a bike may be part of that, but realistically it's not necessarily relevant. Now, it becomes even worse when we're doing things like the student has to bake a cake or the student has to change the oil in a car, and we're then asking them a question like, what are some of the safety considerations when working as a mechanic or when working as a chef? There is a really unclear connection, and it's a really poor form of evidence when it comes to actually evidencing competency of that particular criteria. So if you are mapping knowledge questions to practical assessments, stop doing it. Okay, it is very, very rare, and you have to look at it when you do it. There has to be that very clear connection. Like, as I said, the criteria is ride a bike, and you're asking them underpinning knowledge. Okay, well, what are some of the key things to understand when riding a bike? And it's really more supplemental evidence than anything else. It's not direct evidence of that particular criteria. Okay, because just because I know how to ride, like I know how to ride a bike doesn't mean I can ride a bike. Okay. And I'll give you a really good example of that. I understand how a rocket works. I can't build a rocket. I understand the principles and the mechanics of it. I can't physically actually do it. So it's important to understand that there's a really big difference between knowledge and practical. And with the vast majority of PCs are going to be practical tasks. Okay, so really there should the knowledge questions that you're putting in there should really be focused primarily around the knowledge evidence. If you're just asking a question against every single PC just because you feel that there's a need to have additional evidence there, often you're going to be looking at a situation where it's going to be quantity over quality, and what ASQA is looking for, what the regulators are looking for, is they're looking for quality. All right, so that's number 1. Please don't map knowledge questions to practical criteria. Number 2, overmapping. Okay, as I said, the challenge that we've got with overmapping is, let's say that you've got 5 things linked to a criteria. Okay, 2 of those things map very strongly, but the other 3 things are very weak, or it's almost impossible to actually understand what the thinking was as to why that's in there. Okay, and I have audited units where we've got like literally 30 criteria linked to a unit. It does not make sense, and it takes me all of about 5 seconds to go, well, the first 4 criteria, like the first 4 questions that you've mapped it to, there's actually no link there, and therefore the assessment's invalid. All right. And a lot of the times a regulator, once they start to see that happening over and over again, like they're looking at this and going, well, it linked to 30 criteria, but I can, I'm struggling to find 1 or 2 criteria. They'll just turn around and go, the assessment tool is not valid. The moment your assessment tool is not valid, your assessment evidence for that student is likely not valid. Okay. The moment that your assessment tool and your assessment evidence is not valid, your assessment system is not valid. Okay. And so what happens is then you've got this domino effect that leads to a massive systematic failure of non-compliance that happens within your system. So when you map things, as I said, it's always going to be an exercise of quality over quantity. And you want to make sure that everything that you've mapped pretty explicitly links back. Now, that can be challenging with some of the really technical qualifications. So, for example, I've written with people in the telecommunications training package, in the UEE training package, and this is where, like, quite often they'll refer to a piece of equipment at a high level, and what is now known as, because of like what is known as in industry is quite different, and so that can make it a lot more challenging to create those links. But broadly, you want to be able to validate the unit, go to the criteria, see the 2 or 3 criteria that it's mapped to, and then very clearly and explicitly be able to make that link between the evidence that you have mapped and the actual criteria itself. Okay. Now, the other thing is, the last one is map to the evidence. Okay. As opposed to just mapping broadly to the assessment. And this is probably where, honestly, people struggle the most, is thinking about it in terms of what the evidence is as opposed to the assessment. So quite often I'll see people that have mapped it and they'll refer me to like an assessment instruction. And so they'll go, oh yeah, but we've asked the students to do that. I'm like, well, that's great that you've asked the students to do that, but where have you actually observed that, or where has that evidence been captured? And so this is where we want to look to areas like, it's been captured in an assessor observation. Well, if it's been captured in the assessor observation, just having it in the assessment instructions is not really good enough, because that's not actually guaranteeing that the assessor has seen it. Like if it's in the student instructions, but you're not signing off that the assessor has actually seen it, how do you know that you're, like, where are you retaining evidence of that? So this is something that happens quite frequently, and it's often why when we're working with providers for the first time and we're working with them to update their tools, we're like, okay, but where is the evidence? So having those assessor observations are really important. Now, if it's not in the assessor observations, it might be in an additional document. So it might be in a form that the student has to develop. It might be in meeting minutes that are captured. It might be in a project or a report that the student has to write. And so therefore, that's what then goes into the mapping guide as well, is, for example, I might have a particular criteria, and what I'll say with that is, let me just actually pull up like an example of how we do this. Okay, so I'm just looking at a unit that I'm working on at the moment. Individual state territory requirements for reporting of the incident are accessed and interpreted. And I've got that linked to a assessor observation, and I've also got it linked to an email that the student has to write to the CEO, because within the email we've stated, and we've again linked that back to the observation, that the student has to clearly state what the legislative requirement is for reporting of that incident. So for reporting of the notifiable incident, which is, obviously like WorkSafe New South Wales, WorkSafe WA, WorkSafe Queensland, things like that. So that's in the body of the email, and it's also in the assessor observation for the assessor to confirm, yes, I've cited it in the email. Okay, so those are the 2 places that we're going for evidence, where we're clearly seeing that that particular criteria has been covered. Now, what we'll often hear from people is like, yeah, but we've asked the students to put that in there. It's great that you've asked the students. So like, you've tackled problem number 1 in that you've designed it into the assessment. But when it comes to rules of evidence, validity and sufficiency, this is where it really comes into it. Is there a valid form of evidence to cover that particular criteria. And that's what we really need to focus on is like, where is the evidence? So try not to map to assessments, try to map to specific assessor observations or specific documents. That's going to make your mapping guides probably smaller, but it's going to make them far more explicit, far more valid, and far more likely to pass audit. Now, of course, guys, if you're finding all of this really difficult to understand, we've got a whole range of videos on how to create assessment. I think we've got up to like 3 different playlists now. There's probably in excess of 2 or 3 or 4 hours of content on how to write good assessments with a really good focus on mapping and practical assessment. Of course, at the end of the day, if you don't have enough time, you can always reach out to Anna Wire Education Services. We have a whole range of fully contextualized, ready-to-go assessment tools, and we work with providers all the time to develop assessment tools that specifically meet your cohort, your requirements, your delivery methods, your clustering. 99% of what we do is like highly contextualized to a particular client. So you can always reach out to us at Laura or Lauren at annawire.org, and we will provide you with some more information on how we can help you. Otherwise, guys, I hope you found this helpful. Have a great day. My name is Lauren Hollows for Anna Wire Education Services.